Okay, so now we're ready to move on. So the first thing I want you to do, and this is going to be your tutorial about using the paths tool, is I want you to create a new layer and call this Paths Apple. Okay, so that's your first step. So stop and do that. Now the next step is you're saying, oh, Miss G, I don't have any room here to create another something on my page. Well, guess what? That's why we can create multiple artboards. Now, artboards are like multiple pieces of paper on your desk. So here's one artboard, and you can see right here is your artboard tool. And now if you click this, this selects one of your artboards, but it also allows you to create a new one. So you can do a couple things. One is you can take your artboard and hold down Alt and duplicate everything on it. But you might say, oh, I don't want to do that. If you lock a layer, it will only duplicate whatever is unlocked. So that's also handy. So what I want you to do is I want you to lock your shape layer right here. And then I want you to use your artboard tool, hold down Alt, and duplicate this artboard. So now do that right now. Now, another thing you can do with your artboard is you can actually draw out a size of an artboard, or you can just manually change the size. Here you can see there's different presets, so you could actually create a tabloid size, and you can change the orientation, and you can move it around. And right here, you'll see all the artboards, and you can actually delete it, and you can actually label them as well. And then you can just go back to the selection tool. So you should have another artboard that looks exactly like your other artboard with nothing on it, and save. So let's start talking about paths. So there's this wonderful tool right here. It's called the pen tool. You can click on it, or you can use the shortcut of P, and this is your pen tool. Now, your pen tool lets you create paths. Any object is created from paths. So if I look at any of these other objects right here, you can see these are paths, right? But shapes are pre-made paths, and we want to be able to create our own custom shape, all right? So the pen tool allows us to do that. So paths, these are straight lines between anchor points, and the pen tool allows us to create these anchor points. So you can think of that all artwork is made up of these paths. It's like the skeleton, and the line segments are the overall structures that you create. So the pen tool lets us create these anchor points. But there's a difference between an open and a closed path. You can see right here, if I create an object and I hover back to the original anchor point, there now is this little circle that shows up in the little lower right-hand corner of the pen tool, and that lets us close an object. So there's closed paths and there's open paths, and it's important to understand the difference. So when we close a path, basically you're taking the anchor points and you're closing your object. And sometimes you might want to do that, and sometimes you might not want to do that. And that just really affects a lot of times if you're filling your object with any swatch or pattern or what have you. So those are closed and open paths. But path tool is more than just creating these straight lines. The beauty of path is that it allows you to create curves and create any sort of shape that you want. So if I click and then I go to another point, when I'm clicking and I drag, I can then create a curve. And if I keep going, the curve kind of continues, and it can be kind of weird, right? So something that's very, 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 very helpful is that when you're actually using your pen tool is if you are making a curve, you bring your pen back to the anchor point you just set. You can see right here, there's a little like denotation, and you can reset your points. So what I want you to do right now is to stop, select your pen tool, and try just a freehand drawing the shape of an apple. So you click, you drag, and you make the curve. You reset it, you drag, you reset, you drag, you reset, you drag, and then play around with not resetting it and see what the difference is. So I want you to play around with clicking and dragging, not resetting, and seeing what that does, and creating and then resetting. So that's what you should stop and do right now. Now that you've done that, I want you to also play around with creating a couple shapes that are not closed and some shapes that are closed. So see the difference, right? So remember, any of these shapes that you make over here from the pre-made shapes, they're all closed paths. The rectangle, the rounded rectangle, the ellipse, the polygon, all that. There are no open points or ends, except for if you use the spiral tool. All right, so closed paths color the fills evenly. The open paths do not fill evenly. And it's important, especially if you wanted a stroke all around your object, you have to close your path. All right, so now that you've done that, you've created closed and open paths, we're on to our next step. We want to actually create an apple. So what I want you to do is, again, I want you to use your artboard tool, and I want you just to create an artboard here and change the preset to letter and move it around so it lines up. And here, I'm going to want you to actually trace an apple from an actual image. So if we go online, and I find an apple and I'm like, this is a good apple, what I want you to do, and within a Mac computer, you right click, and I want you to save image as, and I want you to call it apple. And you could save it to downloads. It might be easier if you just save it to the desktop and click save. There's a couple ways to put this image onto your document. So remember, we're always saving. You can do file, and you can place. Take that image, you can place it, and it loads it up and places it right there. Or the other option you can do is you can just drag the image. Something very important to realize is that it is not actually putting this image here. It is creating a link to the other document. So if this image that's on my desktop gets deleted, when I open up this document, it's going to say, we don't know where this image is, because this isn't actually exist in Illustrator. It's merely placed there. So now I want you to find an image from the internet and place it onto your new artboard. So now that you've done that, I want you to actually create a new layer and call this one Paths to Apple or something like that, and lock your other layers. The reason why we want this on a lock layer is so we don't want it to actually be selected by accident. And you can also resize it so that it's a little easier to view. So I'm looking here and you can see, oh, here's my image. If you accidentally put this on another layer, like say for example, this was accidentally on this layer, you just drag it and put it on the Paths Apple layer and lock it. So your Paths Apple layer should have nothing on it. The other layer should be locked. So the goal of using the pen tool is to really have the least amount of points as possible. All right. So what I want you to do now is use the pen tool. You have your image. Make sure you have a stroke and no fill. So go here, whatever your color is, it doesn't really matter. And I want you to try to go around and trace your shape. So you're going to find sort of the main points, and you want just to trace the main shape of your apple. Click and drag, reset, click and drag, reset, click and drag, reset. So remember, you want to try to be doing this with the least amount of points possible. And there's a huge difference between my image right here, which has, I don't know, like less than 10 points. And I've seen people do this where they're just like bump, 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 bump. First of all, that looks really janky and not smooth, and it's hard to manipulate. Now I want you to create the general shape of your apple using the path tool. Okay, now that you've done that, you might say, Miss G, it doesn't look quite exactly how I want it to look. Now we're going to actually go in and manipulate it. And this is where the direct selection tool comes into play. So if you use the direct selection tool right here, this allows us to manipulate the specific points and the specific handles of the curves. So by clicking on any of these points, it gives us options. So I want you to go in and try manipulating the curves and your points so that it really more reflects your apple. Now, if you say, oh no, Miss G, this curve right here, it needs to be rounded and it actually isn't. If you select one of these points, you can convert it from a corner to a round. Another thing that's really helpful is we go to the pen tool and we click, we can bring up all these options. And remember, we can cycle through using the Alt. So I can cycle through by holding Alt and clicking. But we can also bring out that panel. And here we have just the regular pen tool plus, minus, and this little, you're like, oh, it looks kind of like a point. So this is plus. This means you can add points to your apple, which can be helpful. Minus, say, oh, I have a point here I don't really need. And then here's the convert tool, which allows you to convert any point that's an angle to a curve and a curve to a point. So for example, I'm going to show you. If I create something that's just no curves and I click and I drag, I can then create this into a curve. Or if I have something that's curved and I want to get rid of it, I just click on that anchor point and it goes back to being straight. So now your next step is to be using these tools right here, plus, minus, the convert, and the direct selection tool. And I want you to refine your apple. Good job. So now that you've actually refined your apple, I want you to continue on and finish creating your apple and create the stem and create the leaf. And then always importantly, make sure you're saving your work. So now that you've got a general idea of how to use the pen tool, I want you to go and to the website that I've provided, the Bezier game, and I want you to get started and to practice using the pen tool on this tutorial.